Thank you so much, Louise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to OTF Connect. Thank you for giving us your very own time to join us tonight. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here from across the province and so many new people to OTF Connect. So welcome all, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Garfield Ginny Newman from the Critical Thinking Consortium, who will be facilitating tonight's session on creativity and innovation through critical thinking. Welcome, Garfield. Good that you're here.
Thanks, Syria. So, well, sorry for the delay. Air Canada suddenly announced they'd canceled a flight, so as you probably know, I ended up on a flight that put me home rather tight, but hopefully you had good use of that time. And I don't know if you can read the cartoon that I'm starting with here. It's why digital technology will never entirely replace paper, and you can see in the background in the bathroom the eye roll. I thought was a good little bit of humor to start us off with. And we want to take a look at nurturing creativity, and given our limited time, we may have to go through a few things a little quicker than I'd hoped, but we'll get started. I wanted you just to type in, if you would. I'm proposing here 3 different ways that we might see the relationship between critical thinking and creativity. You'll see there is a 4th option, and you might say, yeah, I don't like any of your options, I think there's a better one, and you can describe that. So do you think critical thinking and creativity are best represented by A, that they're 2 different ways of approaching thinking? Do you think it's B, that there are ways in which they're common, but ways in which they're distinct? Do you think it's C, that one's a subset of the other? And if you're going to say C, then I'd like you to type in the window. And Louise will set up a way we can poll, I think, if she said that, thank you. If you're picking C, which is the purple dot and which is the orange? In other words, which one's the subset of the other? Or maybe D is your choice, that there's another way. And if you pick D, vote first, and then give us a little explanation. Just give you a couple of minutes to weigh in.
And folks, just in case you didn't notice my comment in the chat there, where the green checkmark tool was, is now multiple choice, and you can make your selection there.
So I see we have 1 vote at this point for D. Could you, if you're voting D, give us a little description of how you would see it? Amanda's torn between C and D, so Amanda, I'm going to help you out a little bit. Would a yin-yang capture your sense that there's C and so critical and creative kind of bleed into each other? There's a little dot of each in the other. Would that work? Yin-yang works. Okay, we got some people going for that. Okay, let me just and I like those. When people are saying, "Well, I'm not sure," and so on. As we work through what we'll think about this, the reason I wanted to raise this is that traditionally, I would argue in the past, A was often cited where we would talk, even our achievement chart, you'll notice that we separate critical thinking and creative. They're both under thinking, but there's critical and there's creative. And often in the past, we saw them as distinct ways. Creative thinking being less structured, more free-flowing and so on, where critical is logical and sequential and so on. I think over the past few years, then we've moved more of the conversation towards B, recognizing that, well, there are some ways they're similar and they overlap, but some things are distinct. And then I think we've seen more conversation saying, well, maybe even B isn't quite it. I've had people say to me, B works if you overlap the Venn diagram instead of partway all the way, then because the two have to go together. C suggests that if creativity is purple, then creativity is within critical, but not all critical is creative. If you reverse that, you'd be saying elements of creative thinking might be critical, but not all creative thinking is critical. So people have played with these. I raise this, by the way, in part because my fear, and let me just give you a little bit of a context. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at a conference of arts educators in North Carolina. And I began my talk, keep in mind it's a room full of 300 arts educators, I began my talk by saying there's no such thing as creative thinking. And you have this collective gasp and probably wondering why they've hired this guy to come and speak about at a creativity conference who starts with there's no such thing as creative thinking. So let me explain just very briefly why we opened with that comment. Creative thinking, if you look at the neuroscience behind this, and by the way, a very interesting person to look at a TED Talk by Dr. Rex Young, if you have an interest in this. I just post his name there. Dr. Rex Young has a great TED Talk. He's a neuroscientist studying the neuroscience behind creativity is his work. And he's at the University of Albuquerque. And what Rex Young points out is that there's no part of the brain devoted to creativity. That when we engage kids in a creative exercise, what we would consider a creative exercise, it's the same part of the brain that lights up, as would light up if you gave them a critical thing. It's the frontal lobes. That creativity is driven by frontal lobe activity. This old view of the 80s, right brain, left brain, on one side's creative, the other is simply not true. That creativity activates the frontal lobe, the executive functioning in the brain. And as we've looked at this, we've realized that creativity is not a distinct part of the brain. It's not a distinct way. And I said to the audience, my fear is that creativity has far too often been relegated as the poor second cousin in terms of rigor to critical thinking. Critical thinking is seen to have rigor. Creativity is seen to be a bit fluffier. And as a result, I don't think we pay it its due. And we feel like we can't assess it. And that real rigor comes from critical thinking. I want to suggest to you that creativity, and notice I'm carefully saying creativity as opposed to critical thinking. What we are now saying in the critical thinking consortium, this is the language we're using. We believe that there are dimensions of thinking. So this is the phrasing we're using lately, dimensions of thinking. And one of those dimensions will be critical. Another dimension would be creative. Another could be collaborative. So when we look at dimensions of thinking, the creative part is the generative, the creation of new possibilities and new ideas. But if kids can't select which of those ideas have value, which of those are worth pursuing, then all they have is a bunch of ideas they don't know what to do with. So what we're doing is increasingly thinking critical and creative thinking are parts or subsets of good quality thinking, and they're both important in our classrooms. So this is just to take us back really briefly. Many of you have been to previous critical thinking tasks, so just to give us some context for this evening, to remember that some of us thinking critically, a couple of things have to happen, and you'll see a connection to what I just said. That they're making an assessment or a judgment of some kind. That they're engaged in critical thinking when they make a reasoned judgment of some kind, where they consider criteria. And so the core of all critical thinking is making a judgment using criteria. And these are the tools that we've talked about, and those of you, many of you will have seen this, that critical thinking engages kids as a community of thinkers, where they engage with what we call critical challenges, invitations to solve meaningful problems, and that they use these 5 intellectual tools to help support. Now what I want you to do is just for a moment, pause, and substitute, where I've got critical thinking, imagine creativity. And what I want you just for a moment is ask yourself, do any of these, could you substitute creative and still use this framework? Just take a minute and look at it. Are any of these pieces not a part of creative thinking? Just give you a minute to share that, and then I'll get some thoughts. Or you can type a thought in the notebook. Okay, let me just try out some thoughts. I see some that they all fit, maybe not background. Scott thinks it fits rather well. Let me tell you, first of all, if I were to take the first bubble, the community thinkers, if I want to encourage creativity in my class, it would seem to me as important that I've created a culture in my classroom where the unexpected is tolerated, where unique approaches are embraced, that I also have to create a community of thinkers who engage in that generative notion, that if I don't encourage creativity, if I don't create the climate for it, it won't happen. Let me give you an example. Many of you may know Jim Carrey. Grew up in Newmarket and went to high school, I believe, in Burlington. And when you look at his bio, Jim Carrey, his grade 7 teacher, told the students if they worked hard and finished their work, the last 10 minutes of the class, Jim could come up and entertain them. I think that's a wonderful way of embracing Jim Carrey's zany antics, as opposed to, oh, he's a class clown and difficult. It's used to say, hey, let's embrace that as a motivator for kids. So how do we create the climate? Critical challenges should involve kids in generating new solutions, new ideas. Even something as simple as interpreting a primary document or reading a Shakespearean play. Having kids look at it through a different lens. Creativity would be involved if I said, generations of people have read this speech from Hamlet and interpret it like this, and yet this student comes along and has a whole different take, right? That they've got a different spin on how they might look at this. So beautiful examples of creativity in everything kids do. When we look at the intellectual tools, and by the way, I mentioned Rex Young. He outlines 5 frames or 5 ways we support creativity. And Rex and I were presenting, I should have mentioned, Rex was the keynote speaker at the North Carolina conference. He was the first keynote, I was the second keynote. His talk beautifully set up my talk because the 5 things that he talked about the neuroscience confirming were essentially our 5 intellectual tools. What he said, if you know nothing about what you're asked to innovate in, the area you're asked to innovate in, you will not do a very good job. You cannot be creative if you know nothing about how to dance, you know nothing about the topic, you know nothing about the subject area. That creativity requires that we have some understanding of the field in which we're working. We have to build children's background if we're going to innovate. Children don't know if their innovation is worthwhile, useful, if they have no criteria. How does Picasso decide when he's painting Guernica, does this work in black and white or should I add color? Well, he must have had some criteria that he's using to decide, is this a powerful work of art? So criteria guides us in the innovations. Which of these neat ideas generated in a business class, in a science class, are worth exploring and carrying further? We use criteria. What's the vocabulary? So I love the fact, Katie, thank you for posting that. What is the creative thinking vocabulary in the arts document that we need to make sure that kids understand that will connect to? So for example, to appreciate a work of art. What does that mean? Well, appreciate comes from the root to appraise value. It doesn't mean it's not I like or dislike, but I see the merits of the work. So notice, do kids understand what it means to appreciate the art? It means to assess value, to appraise value. So what is that value that it gives us? So thinking strategies. We're going to look at a few of these later. How do we give students not just, some kids are by nature creative and some aren't. Well, sure, some are by nature gifted in math and some are by nature good writers. Yet we don't relegate all other children to Bs because, well, you just aren't naturally that way. Our job as educators is to provide children the tools they need to be as innovative and creative as possible, to write as well as possible, to reason in math as well as possible. So just like we would provide literacy strategies, just as we would provide mathematical reasoning strategies, so too we need to provide thinking strategies that help children to generate new and novel ideas. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up with the comments here. Thank you, Louise, for posting the link to the document. beautiful. The risk-taking, the Picasso, the parameters. By the way, if you haven't seen the movie Mona Lisa's Smile, I think we have a clip coming up if we get to it, but definitely a wonderful movie to see, if we get to it, to see the first lesson taught in teaching art history entirely in a transmissive way, and the second lesson taught in a way that challenges kids to think about what is art, and who makes the rules, and how do we decide what's worthwhile. It's you know, the first 20 minutes of that movie, and you have good critical thinking and creativity summed up really nicely. We work with 19 Habits of Mind. If you have a chance, take a look at the 19 habits. They include things like perseverance, attention to detail, curiosity, risk-taking, empathy. It's always interesting for me to say to teachers, go through that list of 19 habits and select 5 that you think would be important if creativity matters in your class. And I can guarantee you, you will go, oh yes, there are habits of good thinkers that are definitely required in a creative classroom. So what I'm doing here is saying, the revelation for me at that conference was what we have been promoting as a powerful framework for good critical thinking for the last 20-some years. We've come to realize is equally powerful if creativity is my goal. That I create the environment for creativity to flourish. I provide assessment. I provide the kind of challenge and invite kids to innovate. And I make sure I build the toolkit that will allow them to innovate. So that the same, and what I like about this is if you want quality thinking in your class, I don't need 2 different approaches to nurturing thinking. I have the same approach. The question is whether I'm after generative thinking or I'm after what we call reactive thinking. So we'll just move on from there. I hope that was somewhat convincing. Some of you will have seen this in other presentations. I'm just trying to lay a few foundations. First of all, around the outside of this circle, you have the 6 prompts we work with in critical thinking, so we can critique. I could ask you, if you saw a movie recently, was it a good movie? What's your criteria for a good movie? You critique the movie. If I asked you to compare it to 2 other movies, someone mentioned to me today they saw Get Hard, a new Will Ferrell movie. I asked him if he liked it. He said, not really. I said, well, you just critique the film, tell me your reasons why. I said to him, well, which of these 3 films, Talladega Nights, Elf, or Get Hard, is the best Will Ferrell movie? Oh, he said Elf right away. Tell me why. He just didn't judge the better or best. Okay? So he compared 3 movies to make a choice. He then began to say to me, well, I think Jim Carrey would have done a better job in the role of Get Hard. I would have cast him. I said, oh, you just reworked the piece. Here's how I would have improved that movie. If I asked you for what's the deep message in that movie, you'd be decoding and probably thinking I'm crazy because there probably isn't a deep message. When we design, if I ask kids to create a poster to advertise that, you're designing the specs, and perform, play a piece of music, deliver a presentation. What you see in the center of this circle is an attempt to begin looking at what qualifiers could I use that I simply add to a task or a question to push the critical thinking. So if I ask students, I'd like you to create an appropriate work of art for a kindergarten class to help them think about, we'd unpack, well, what does it mean when we say appropriate for that age? Or I want you to curate an exhibit of indigenous art, and it must include 8 powerful works of art. What 8 pieces would you pick? Well, what's our criteria for a powerful work of art? So by dropping one of these terms in, most likely key, fair, valid, well-crafted, authentic, you add a qualifier which invites children to think and add criteria into it. So I just want to put up, by the way, this is very useful in critical or creative thinking, but it's just a way to help quickly tweak our questions. And you will get this emailed out to you, that Louise will post it. If you don't recall the 6 prompts, the slide just captures the 6 prompts, so you can connect to that. And I don't want to belabor it because we want to get into the creativity. And I think we'll jump past this. Some of you will have probably seen this in workshops. If not, you can certainly Google friendship algorithm, and we can send out a link as well, Louise, I believe, can post for this. It's a very funny 2 minutes of the Big Bang Theory, where all 6 ways of thinking critically can be teased out of it. So because we're a little short on time, I won't have you look at this clip. But it is a good way to kind of summarize the 6 prompts for critical thinking. So we return back to this question. I many of you at the beginning some weren't sure, some were picking others. I won't redo the poll, but I just want you to think about it. And I was delighted to see nobody any longer picks A. That B, we continue to think, well, I think it does overlap. The biggest number, C, that there is a relationship. So that's what we want to look at. Let me just take a moment. I just went through very quickly the 6 prompts. There are the 6 prompts again. On the right-hand side, I've got reactive. And what we mean by reactive thinking is, when I asked the person earlier today, did you like the movie Get Hard? That's that's asking for reactive thinking. Respond to something that exists. Write a review, a restaurant review would be reactive. In that, I'm asking you to visit a restaurant that exists and review how well it meets the criteria for a good restaurant. Whereas generative thinking is where I'm asking you to come up with new ideas. So come up with a new concept for a restaurant. Pitch an idea for a movie that would be unique in some way. Those would be generative. I'd like you just to take a minute. And if you were to slide, and so notice I want to make this a continuum. Each of these 6, from reactive, I think, critique the piece, I think is reactive, and I think another one's generative. Where would you put them? But do this as a continuum. So you might say, well, I think one of these sits in the middle. I think it has both reactive and generative opportunities. Could you just take a minute and maybe quickly type in, you could put critique, rework, just use the first word, design, decode. Just type in reactive or generative, or you could put leaning towards one or leaning towards the other, or you can just say middle if you think that's it. Just going to give you a couple of minutes if you would. Where would you put these prompts? Do they tend to lend themselves to reactive thinking, generative thinking, or both? Okay, just a couple of minutes. I'd like to see some thoughts on that. So I'm going to just ask you now, and I want you to think about this for a moment. Could anyone make a case that I could ask you to critique something? Sorry, I just wanted to read a couple of these responses. So interesting. I like this critique and decode, a reactive judge begins to transition. Could anyone make the case that many of these could lie more in the center, or at least the center leaning towards the generative? And here's the case I'll make. I've had people say, well, even critique, that 30 people write a review on the same restaurant, and the reviews look very similar, and they're very solid reviews, and they use the criteria, and one person comes along and has a wholly different spin on it, and comes up with a review that just, wow, I never would have thought of approaching it that way. Could a critique, in fact, be generative? Is it possible that a judge could actually be, yeah, I never really thought of it that way? So, yeah, notice that I'm like Jim, the way you put this, that they're somewhat contextual. So, generative is looking at things slightly different than many others do. Notice again, I can give a very solid reactive response. Simon Cowell's going, Whereas generative would have me going, you know, I would never have interpreted that way. That's a really interesting way to look at this. 9 out of 10 people think this way, you think that way. And so as we played with this, we just began to realize it's not always as clear and easy as we think to label these, and it's what's leading us to say that what's at the core of what we want to do is quality thinking. That we don't want any task to limit kids in what their reaction to it might be, that if we think about the context, it could be generative in nature. Now, let's just get into a more detailed definition of, so what do we mean about, you know, critical and creative, as I've been talking about. And I thought this quote by Robert Weisberg was helpful. All who study creativity agree that for something to be creative, it's not enough just to be novel. It has to have value. It has to add value to it. So it's an interesting twist as we look at this. And this is what I've been saying to you as a result. Rather than talking about creative thinking and critical thinking, perhaps what we should be doing in schools is focusing on quality thinking that has both critical and creative dimensions. And we stop the tension between is this critical or is this creative, and we start thinking about just, so what's the quality of the thinking we're looking at, and how can we enhance it by considering the dimensions. And to further that, I'll just give you, this is the criteria that's generally accepted by researchers in the field of creativity. That the root of the word creative comes from the word create. And that, I think, is an instructive and important piece. That anything we do that is creative, we were setting out to create something, whether that's a theory, a work of art, a response. To being creative is to create. Now, that creation needs to be novel in some way. So if I simply replicate something, you wouldn't ascribe creativity to someone who created an exact replica of something else. But not only must it be novel in some way, it has to add value. This is Weisberg's point. That it has to have value, it has to solve the problem. So I mentioned Guernica earlier by Picasso. What was he trying to do with that painting? And he has to decide, yes, this is a unique way, this is a painting unlike others have done, but does it do what I need it to do? So notice the 3 criteria, that children create something that is in some way unique or novel, and it solves the problem. And that third one is really critical. Otherwise, we have kids coming up with really cool things, but it doesn't really address the problem. So another, and again, I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to limit the videos, but if Louise can post the link, that would be great. John Seely Brown has a wonderful talk, and I'm just going to summarize it for time. I'll just give you the. John Seely Brown is an expert in technology and learning in the U.S., and he has a wonderful talk on what does it mean to be an entrepreneurial learner. And he starts off in the talk right away by saying, by entrepreneurial learner, he doesn't mean that in a business sense. He doesn't mean an entrepreneurial learner as in being an entrepreneur, but he means about being a learner who seizes any moment, at any point, to learn something. And that he talks about, and I just love the phrase he uses, he talks about technology, and he references iPads, iPhones, and so on, and he refers to them as curiosity amplifiers. That they allow us now to, hey, this is an interesting idea. So notice as I'm talking and I mention something, boom, Louise posts a link, and some of you might be listening to me and on your handheld device going, oh, I'm going to look that up. Wow, this is cool. I'll look at that later. But your curiosity allows you to start to explore and to find. So I want to just raise this because we start thinking about learning in a 21st century context. The opportunities for kids to innovate, to try things out, to share, to learn on the go is huge. Just to advance this a little bit, if we were thinking about writing our own definition for an entrepreneurial learner, I'm sure many of you have played 4 pictures in a word. If you haven't, in 4 pictures in a word, you're presented 4 images, a series of letters, and some blank spaces, and you have to figure out what word you can make with the letters that would fit in the spaces that would connect the 4 images that you have. I've used this with children, but in a slight variation. So I take the idea of 4 pictures in a word, and if I said to you, I want you to help me write a definition for an entrepreneurial learner or for innovation. Here are 4 images. If you could just type in the chat window for me, really quickly, a word or a phrase that comes to mind as you look at these 4 images. What word or phrase do these 4 images get you to think about? Okay, I'm just going to turn off my mic for a moment and let's let your juices flow. Tell me word or phrase you might see. Okay, keep the ideas flowing. Here are 4 new images. Keep writing ideas. What are these 4? Can you come up with a word or a phrase looking at these? And one more set for you. By the way, just to let you know, the top right image is the first the first train in North America. And if you look closely, it's essentially a series of stagecoaches hooked together and put on iron rails. So what other words come to mind? I'll just give you 30 seconds more. Now, I'm just going to pause you and just point out what I'm doing here. If you were my class and I wanted us to come up with a definition for creativity or innovation, and I'll tell you another variation in a moment. Every child in my class can participate. I've thrown up an image, and they just start to generate ideas. And if I were to take all these ideas and say, okay, now let's see if we can't pick some of the best. Where do we have some overlap? Where can we find some connections? Because you're going to help me write a definition of what it means to be innovative, to be a creative thinker. Let's start pulling that together. You just generated lots of rich, wonderful phrases working from images. But then I'm going to move kids to words. And using a Wordle lets me introduce, so I've just taken some writing on creativity, dump it into Wordle, it creates a word cloud. And I ask kids 2 things. First thing I ask, what words on this Wordle are you unfamiliar with? So I can build a little bit of vocabulary, build a bit of background knowledge here. If they were to say, well, what does computation mean? Or tinkerers. Why did it say tinkerers? And we can talk a bit about this. But then I ask kids, so you guys had lots of wonderful words. What should we add from the Wordle that are things that other people talk about that we didn't list? So I might, for example, pick the one that I mentioned saying tinker. I think that's interesting, that creative people tinker. I like that. There may be other words that people grab, well, I think we should add this to it. So we've begun to craft our definition based on images. I show some words. That generates a few new ideas. And then I might show them, well, here are what some other people have said about entrepreneurs or about creativity, and you can decide. You'll notice I have very short to much longer, so I can easily differentiate in my class by handing out, here's a definition other people have said. I'm not saying this is the right answer. I'm asking you, is there something in these quotes that you could pull out to add to the quote, to our definition that we've been building? Is there something from our definition we could add to one of these? Let's craft a definition for an entrepreneurial learner or a creative thinker or whatever you want to phrase it, but it needs to be owned by the kids. I've started with visuals. I've gone to a Wordle where they work with single words. Now I've gone to a statement or a phrase in which kids look at that and they say, oh, that's an idea we're missing. We should add that in. What I'm doing is having kids co-construct with me a definition that they own. And I love, thank you, this minimal risk, kids engage in, and they know the definition. Now, you can use this in multiple contexts. I was doing one earlier today with some teachers in Ottawa around global citizenship. We did the same thing. Here's a series of images. Tell me how they connect, what words would you use. And the kids would then build a definition of what does it mean to be a global citizen, but following the same approach. So I want to show you this, first of all, to give you a strategy, but secondly, just to get us thinking about how do we define creativity. Okay? So my next piece for you is just to start to talk about, and this is where we'll spend the balance of the time we have together, how do we go about nurturing that creative dimension of thinking? So these are the kind of practical strategies. We've got, I think, some agreement that creativity has to solve a problem, kids have to create, it engages their thinking. So what are some of the key things we have to do? First of all, we need to nurture creativity by creating opportunities. And I'll just quickly touch on some pieces here. That I think kids need to, creativity is not frivolous. It's not, just come up with wild and crazy ideas for fun. Although it might be fun to do the creative exercise, it should be a purposeful reimagining. So it's reimagining the possible to help us come up with, more powerful ways to communicate, ways to solve problems, ways to entertain. What is the issue we're trying to solve? We give kids a meaningful task, and we give them time. The other piece I want you to note here, creativity does not flourish under tight time constraints. To me, it always strikes me as odd that we might give kids at high school or university on an exam, come up with a piece of creative writing or be creative. Well, I don't necessarily have the great idea while I'm sitting there. I could be walking home 20 minutes later and have a great idea. But because we put time constraints, but that idea didn't fall in the right time frame, so it doesn't count. That strikes me as hugely problematic. John Cleese, many of you will know from Monty Python fame, talking on creativity. John Cleese said, one of my colleagues from Monty Python was much more talented than I was, naturally more talented, yet I produced better skits than he did. And he said, I was always puzzled as to why I was able to come up with better skits than my colleague. And then I realized that he would tend to take the first idea and he'd run with it. That's what he'd go with. And I wouldn't. He said, I would stick around for a long time, rethinking, reworking. And this is the phrase I like that he said. He said, I learned to live with the problem longer. And because I learned to live with the problem longer, I had better skits in the end. And I just love that phrase for kids. Kids need to learn to live with the problem, to let it percolate, to kick it around, to think about it, to change their mind. Let me just come back to that in a moment. Today I was doing a math lesson in the school in Ottawa, and the kids were considering different ways that they could solve a problem, deciding which one would be best given a certain context. And the point that most deeply touched me is when this young girl, she said, I was solving it this way, and then I realized I think I misunderstood the question as I listened to other people, and so then I began to listen to them, and then I did this, and I thought, that was just beautiful. By listening to others, thinking about it more, working with it, I came up with a different answer. I want to suggest to you that if we want kids to think creatively, to solve problems, they need to be allowed to muck about, change their mind. They need to be able to do things different to work with. Let them live with the problem. Next piece. I wonder, Louise, how do we have this? Do we have this queued up to show a little bit?
I can drop the link in the chat for you right now. I'll just suggest that we do it that way as opposed to a web tour, just because of the original glitches we were having.
So what we're going to do is just watch about, 60 seconds of this clip, and then come on back and join us. And Louise probably has a way you can trigger for us that you're back. We won't watch it all, just for lack of time. I'll speak to it in a moment, though. If you could just watch the clip, maybe for 60 seconds, and then join us. Okay, so maybe we could just Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Did you enjoy that? Just a pure column 2 preference question. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, a happy face, a sad face, whatever you'd like to use. Just if you just did you enjoy the video? All right, let me just speak to it for a moment. Yes, The Bad Romance, the Lady Gaga. By the way, if you go to YouTube and you type in The History Teachers, you'll find that they've done 57 of these. This one, by the way, I want to be clear. As much as I think it was kind of fun, I would not want to show this to grade 4s looking at early civilizations and early societies. I think it would scare the bejesus out of them. But I do find it an interesting use of pop music, and I'll come back to it as a critical thinking link in a moment. There is another one, by the way, when you go to the link, thank you, that Louise put up. There is one done that I would use with grade 4s looking at ancient Egypt. It's done to Green Day's, now I'm trying to remember the actual name of the song, but I Hope You Had the Time of Your Life. But it's actually called, oh, someone help me out with the name of that song, and it's on mummification. And it's quite funny, but here's why I like this from a thinking perspective. First of all, getting kids, they can critique this. Did they do a good job? Is it accurate? Did they pick the right images? So first of all, they can critique. But imagine if your kids, because what you have to do here is tell me about the history of, tell me about mummification, whichever it is, in less than 3 minutes. What are the most important facts you'd include? What images would you use to illustrate it? And what will you drive home? Thank you, good riddance, that's it. What's your central message? Because that's your course, you keep coming back to it. So imagine just, kids starting to say, well, we have to create our own, pick a song we like, change the words by using the information we found, find some images. I think it could be a really fun task for kids. But more to the point, by the way, here are some other ways that we can engage kids in authentic tasks that has them innovate and so on. I've had kids create a sandcastle or a snow sculpture of an important site. Create a life box where you put artifacts in someone's life. Create a board game. Prepare a menu. I won't go through all of these. But these are all tasks that would invite kids to not only learn the content, but to also get kids to have to use the content in innovative or creative ways. And yes, the slides will be posted, I believe, by Louise, so you'll have time to look at that. Monique, thank you for putting out. Flocabulary is a wonderful site for rap songs on different historical events, on literature, and so on. Oh, wonderful. I'm just reading the art classes and the snow sculpturing. So just thinking of ways that we can get kids to, creating a sustainable home. See if you can build a home that others, not just like everyone else. So the opportunities for people to innovate, I think, are endless. And I just want to put this slide and just, some ideas around that. Here's another piece for us to think about in terms of nurturing that creative classroom. And it's a theory proposed by Bruce Campbell, I think early in the 60s, and it's called BVSR. And BVSR stands for Blind Variation Selective Retention. And so you can see here on the slide, the idea is, and I think it's an interesting one for us to think about, I see a typo up there. The blind variation phase is to try to generate as many ideas as we can. So the fancy way of putting that, the greater the heterogeneity and volume of trials, the greater chance of productive innovation. In other words, the more ideas we can get out on the table, the better chance we have of generating some ideas that are worthwhile. What's really important for us to think about is that you want to lower cognitive control during the blind variation phase. So for example, if I give kids criteria, I want you to generate ideas, but they have to meet these criteria, you have raised cognitive control because they have filters, and now they have to filter. The term hypofrontality is the term that Rex Young uses, where what we want to do is we want to say to kids, just generate ideas. Don't worry about whether they're good or bad. In fact, you will kill creativity if kids go, oh, that's a bad idea. That we need to just generate ideas where that we don't filter. And by the way, the note here that I put, like, they can be either spontaneous or deliberative, okay, is this. I might be walking home and I just got a cool idea, spontaneous. And some people just naturally have ideas jump into the head, but not everyone generates ideas. So sometimes it's more deliberative. I use a strategy. I'll show you a few of those in a moment. So I need to come up with an idea. I'm going to use a strategy to help me. Or I just had the coolest idea. I don't know where it came from. So generating ideas can be either. And the other important point is the myth of genius is that geniuses are individuals, where in fact collective genius is far more the truth. We tend, especially in Western society, to celebrate the Einsteins, the Steve Jobs and so on. But all of these people were existing in an environment where ideas were shared and kicked around. You think about great Renaissance artists, well, how many of them are part of a community of thinkers, and that the ideas, and so most scientific breakthroughs have been building on the ideas of others. So really getting kids to collaborate more so than isolate is much better. So blind variation, we just want to generate all the ideas we can. We want to remove filters, we want to remove blocks to get kids thinking. Phase 2, you want to upregulate, and by that we mean, and so see it this way, brainstorming is generate all the ideas you can, put them on a cue card, throw them on the table. Let's see how many of them come up with. Brain steering is when we say, wow, that's great. You guys got 30 ideas out on the table. But let's see if we can pick 5 that are really good ideas. And here's my criteria. So note, brainstorm, generate lots of ideas. Brain steer, have kids select from. Now I need to upload or upregulate cognitive control, which means giving kids some criteria to decide which ideas are worth hanging on to and which ones aren't. This is a really important piece of helping nurture creativity, creating the space in my class for lots of ideas to be thrown out, to think about, to get on the table, but then taking the time for the selective retention. If we only do one, if we go too quickly to selective retention, we lose many opportunities. If we don't get the selective retention, kids have overwhelming number of ideas they're not sure what to do with. A few things that you can do, when I said, being deliberative, blind variation can be enhanced by working on tasks in unconventional order. So instead of doing the things the way we always do, you get kids to do things in a reverse order or a different order. You break the routine tasks, and it helps kids go, hey, I just got a new idea. You allow for distractions from the task. So taking a break and go do something else for a while that lowers the cognitive levels. I don't know what's going on with the typing in here. My apologies. Another strategy is to invite students to think about the problem far away in space or time. So people somewhere in the world need some help on this. Here's the reason for that. If I say, I want you to come up with a solution for your family that will address X. As soon as I put your family in, I've actually created a filter, because now I'm thinking about what does my family need. I need to remove this from the student's immediate place. Say, just, some people somewhere in the world, or a long, long time ago, they needed this. How could they solve it? Don't give me too much context, or it limits my thinking. Get kids to pay attention to visual properties to generate ideas. And just sometimes work on mundane tasks. I saw somebody saying, oh, that's what it was. Thanks, Louise. I thought it was like my typing way worse than I thought. Michelle, thanks for that note that sometimes your best questions come up when you're sleeping, when we're just doing something else. Go wash some dishes. I find when I'm stuck, when I'm trying to do some writing, in the summer when there's grass to cut, we have about 3 acres here, I'll go out and cut grass. And riding on my lawnmower, hey, I've got a cool idea. I'll stop, jot it down on my phone. I don't know if anyone else who have this, but sometimes if I'm really stuck, I'll go lay down for a while. The problem is I'm just starting to relax, an idea comes into my head, and I got to get up and go write it down. But sometimes thinking harder about an idea actually gets us further from innovating, and so we want to enhance blind variation by doing things in different orders, doing a different task. Oh, good point. Too many distractions can dissolve. By the way, notice this is why it's important that they're mundane tasks that don't require me to, if I change my task and I have to think about it, this isn't going to work. I need to go wash some dishes, cut some grass, where my frontal lobes are not engaged. Because if they are, it's going to prevent me from coming up with new ideas. Good point. Turn off the smartphones. This is an interesting caution, that blind variation can be inhibited by brainstorming, and people are often surprised to hear this. But brainstorming, if I tell the students, turn to a partner and brainstorm, or in a group of 4, brainstorm a bunch of ideas, you actually create social stress, because I'm being put on the spot to perform in front of my peers, and it inhibits students because now they're stressed, worried about their ideas not being good ideas. So what we want to do is be careful that when we invite kids to brainstorm, we do that only after kids have been given some time to think on their own, to generate some ideas, so they then come to the group sharing with something to put in that they're not stressing. And it's interesting, I think Michelle pointed out, that you get ideas sitting in traffic jams, probably on your own, and then you want to share them. But if I threw you into the sharing right off the bat, it can inhibit. So some things we have to be thoughtful about in schools. If we want to embrace creativity and we want to embrace BVSR, think about the routines, the expectations, the modeling in your class. Think about how this plays into how we assess student learning. Are we giving them time to think before we assess? Where do we give them when I say curriculum design? Does the task come first or last? If the task comes last, kids learn lots and lots of content and then have a short time period to innovate. I would prefer that kids are given the task right up front and they innovate throughout the learning. And this leads me to the second piece. And that is that we want to guide learning through what I would call choreographing learning experiences. Let kids play. Kindergarten teachers are all over this, but I would argue play is important right up through grade 12, if not into university. Let me muck about with my ideas. I don't mean play like a kindergarten child might go play with a toy in the sand. I mean just let me play with ideas, share them, kick them around. Let me be wrong. Let me figure out why that's not working. So we call this a cascading curriculum, where the task is not the proof you've learned. So too often the task is given, now that I've taught you stuff, I'm going to give you a task and you need to show that you've learned by completing the task. So exactly, Katie, thank you. Play with purpose. Figure it out by engaging with. Give kids the challenge to engage with up front. If you had to solve this problem now, how would you do it? Go. Okay, what's the problem with it? What's not working? What if we learn this? So here's an example of a cascading curriculum as a lesson. That if I wanted to look at, and we were doing this around Pink Day, how can we best ensure that our actions contribute to making a safe and caring community? And kids would be asked right off the bat to create a powerful piece of media. If you had to create a piece of media that would convince others to take part in Pink Day and to make a difference, what would you do? Go. Just start coming up with some ideas, jot them down. And then we begin inquiring. We have a little focus inquiry. Where would you draw the line on? We give kids an issue. So at what point would you step in? At what point would teasing become bullying and you need to step in? And kids have to think about why they would make the decision they make. Then we start talking about, so what are powerful actions people can take to try to create a safe and caring community? Come up with 4 ideas on a ranking ladder of actions you could take that would make a difference. Then we might talk about, so what media could we use to take those powerful ideas to respond to important issues that would convince people? As kids work through each of those 3 other areas, they go back to the original poster or whatever media presentation, and they say, oh, I got a new idea. I've got a new way to change this. So notice what we're doing here is, instead of teaching all the stuff, saying, now take your learning and create a poster, kids start to explore, to try things out, and to integrate new learning. And so we use the term here, choreographing the learning, because we're deciding at each level, what's the new learning kids need that will help them move them along with their thinking. And from an assessment lens, the assessment for thinking, There are clear targets for quality thinking established up front, and that the guidance we give kids helps push their thinking, helps them think more deeply, helps them decide, am I meeting the criteria. I am watching our time, so I want to just touch on a few more pieces that I think are quite important here. If we want to help kids be creative, I want to go back to the beginning when I had the TC squared framework up and remind you that if students are going to engage in meaningful, creative exploration, they need deep knowledge. That to innovate, you need to understand the area in which you're innovating. And that means we do need to teach content knowledge to kids to allow them to take their new learning and innovate. Okay? So I have, but we won't get through them all. I'll just show them quickly and you can review ways that we would teach content that would engage thinking. So my interest in part is if I have to teach content to kids, I want to do it in a way that they construct the knowledge, I don't hand it over. Here's a sample math lesson where kids would develop the understanding of what a like term is by looking at the yes examples and the no examples and pulling out the attributes that all the yes examples have that the no examples don't have, and then they would apply the tester. That I might ask kids to figure out the art period that I'm thinking about. The left are all yes examples of the period, the right are no examples. Again, they don't have to know the paintings. They start looking for trends or patterns that they notice that are present in all the yes that are not present in the no. And over time, I will reveal to them, by the way, you've just defined Renaissance art by pointing out the focus on the human body, the depth, the perspective that's there, the depth you can see in the paintings, the use of classical figures. That all comes through the unpacking of the images, and we arrive at a definition, again, co-constructed. Getting kids to look at different perspectives. Is this a British or an American perspective? How do you know? Can you rewrite it from a different perspective? Checking the claims on a product. Do these claims make sense? Why or why not? Okay. Helping kids understand what equals means. Sorry for going through these quickly. Getting kids to deconstruct pictures, making conjectures, then layering in more seasons. So you can see lots of things, giving kids explanations. But let me pause on this one for a moment. If I ask children in a class, we're going to be looking at democracy in ancient Athens because we want to figure out what we could learn from Athenian democracy that would help us create the best possible democracy here in Canada. So we might learn what not to do or what we should do. Here are 8 facts, all true, about ancient Athens. Your job is to cross out the 2 that would be least important if our goal is to figure out what makes a good democracy. I've just problematized note-taking. Here are 8 facts, cross out 2, figure out which ones aren't, and tell me why. So I'm teaching content and building background knowledge so that children can innovate in a creative way. So I'm building their content knowledge so they can innovate. Then I need to think about the criteria that we use to know that they've got good ideas. So notice one of the things we want to be thoughtful about here, fluency, originality, flexibility, getting at the potential by saying let's generate lots of ideas, let's select our most original ideas, can you use the ideas in a flexible way, okay? And then kids would be thoughtful about what creates good ideas and which one should we pick. Here are some quick examples. I'm going to do this real fast. Getting kids to just generate all the ideas. APC stands for alternatives, possibilities, and choices. How many different uses for a brick is a famous creativity exercise. Kids generate all the ideas for a brick that they can. Then we use, how many ways could you cluster your ideas? So you've got lots of ideas. Could you put them in groupings and label your groupings? Now notice I asked how many different ways. So now you might say to kids, love your clustering. I want you to scramble them and recluster them in a different way with new labels. What would that be? Do a walkabout. Right? Get kids to look at how people did this. Brain steering. If we were using this to help us rethink the classroom for the 21st century, which of the ideas you generated would have the least value? Which would have the most value? Notice I've gone from lots of ideas, clustered ideas, now select best ideas. critical, creative playing together. Okay? Using analogy. Learning is like I said. Kids pick one of these analogies, and they have to take the analogy and just extend it. So how is learning like whitewater rafting? And so you might say, well, you have to take risks, but we all pull together. And there are ups and downs. It's exciting, but it can be frightening at times. Right? Wonderful. By the way, thank you for all the stuff coming, because I think a lot of the ideas you're sharing in the chat are so helpful that everyone, when Louise sends stuff out later, this is really helpful, not just what I'm presenting, but the ideas running there on the side are always a rich opportunity. I want to show you synesthesia because this is such a simple idea and so powerful. Synesthesia, you may know it as a mental condition where people will the number 5 is purple. I mean, they see numbers as colors, or in the brain, the wiring gets crossed in the brain so that the senses kind of overlap, and they generate different ways of seeing things. This is a wonderful opportunity for kids. I'll just quickly explain this and then we'll wrap up. If I asked you, we want to rethink schools for the 21st century, and I would ask you, if learning were a shape, what shape would it be? If you could just quickly type a few thoughts in the window, if you have a minute. Just, if learning were a shape, what shape would it be? Spiral, circle. By the way, often people say a circle, and then they'll say spiral, and then we ask, can you explain why? I love, figure 8. Why that? Mobius strip. Great. So we get kids to start generating. What if it were a color? If learning were a color? And people will say, well, green because it's yellow, it's bright. And then I've had people say, well, no, it's black. And I said, black? Well, yeah, because it absorbs. Someone else said, no, it's white. It's all colors. Iridescent, thank you. Rainbow.